On the Couch Together in Lately in Land and Housing is a weekly show that focuses on current affairs in political landscape pertaining to housing, evictions, equitable access to land, 10-year security, and this evening we will be focusing on climate change and housing. I'm Farida Rabia and Soken Zinzi, and this is On the Couch, where you hear the difference. Now, in this week's discussion, we center around this crucial subject that is climate change and how that impacts all of us. We are going to unpack what climate change is, what it entails, and the repercussions for housing and human settlements. This evening, we are joined by Brandon Abdinor, who is the acting head for Pollution and Climate Change Program, Center for Environmental Rights. Good evening, Brandon. Welcome to On the Couch.
Good evening, Farida, and good evening to the listeners. Thanks for having me.
So, climate change and housing, trying to see how that matches together. So maybe lay it down for us so we can get into the topic.
Super, thanks, Farida. We find in our work that climate change literacy, or the understanding of what it is still relatively low in South Africa. So we tend to want to just do an explainer of what it is, and that helps then contextualize the discussions going forward. So essentially, when we speak or hear about climate change, we're talking about human-caused climate change. The climate has always changed, but we have had this phenomenon for the last 170 years or so, where we now know that human activities are causing a certain type of climate change. What we have in the atmosphere is a natural phenomenon, or what we know as greenhouse gases, so carbon dioxide being a main one. There's also methane and nitrous oxide, and even water vapor is a greenhouse gas. And these gases together effectively create like a blanket effect. So what happens is you have your radiation coming in from the sun, hits the earth, heats up the earth, and then that heat radiates outwards, and this greenhouse gas blanket traps that heat, and that's actually what makes life on earth possible, or one of the things that does. What we are doing, though, as human beings now is adding an additional load of greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. So this blanket effect, it's basically like the blanket's becoming too thick and too hot, and the whole planet is starting to heat up. We know that this is caused predominantly by the burning of fossil fuels. So by burning coal, oil, and gas, we're adding additional greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And since we started burning coal in a serious way in the Industrial Revolution around 1850, we know that the temperature has already increased on average to between 1.1 and 1.2 degrees. And that overheating in turn starts impacting on the climate system. So climate, as we understand it, starts getting additional energy into it, and that starts making a range of changes.
That's a lot for climate change. Okay, so we're speaking about gases, we're speaking about fossil fuels, we're speaking about how we also contribute to that and how that affects our world, and our world is heating up, and it's sort of our fault, and we are trying to change that. So, but like, how does that relate to housing?
Okay, so if we look at what this additional temperature is doing and how it's changing the climate. So the kinds of impacts that we can see in southern Africa, these impacts do vary somewhat all around the world, although predominantly they're the same. For southern Africa, one of the big ones is an overall reduction in rainfall. So in other words, drought. There are then also heat waves and extreme heat events. So I'm just laying these out because then when we think of housing, we know what it is that we're actually responding to. So heat waves and extreme heat events. Where it does rain, such as in the east side of the country, the rainfall events get more intense. So we talk about flooding there. Because of the additional heat and the dryness in most areas, then the risks of wildfires increase. We also see a move southwards in the path of tropical cyclones. So South Africa predominantly has avoided this kind of extreme weather system, but that is starting to change. And we might be seeing a situation in the coming years where areas such as northern KZN coast and northern Limpopo are actually more directly in the pathways of these cyclones. we see a slow sea level rise. So it's not a very fast and a very immediate, but it's already having an impact, and that's coupled with sort of more extreme winds, and storm surges. Starts to see the kind of wave action, not unlike that we saw sort of 3 weeks ago on the coast, which obviously then has an impact and a threat for settlements at very, very close to the coastline. If we take these sort of climate impacts and extrapolate them, what they mean for human activities, availability of water, it's going to impact on food security and already does, damage to infrastructure. So this is something we've seen quite extensively. That in turn over the sort of midterm causes migration of people, and that in turn also sort of slowly starts increasing the risk of civil unrest and even war-like situations taken to the extreme. To give examples, the day zero drought that we had in Cape Town 4 years ago was made 3 times more intense by human-caused climate change. The floods in Durban were also intensified by climate change, not by that much, around 8% more intense, but that's the kind of thing that we can expect to see and are seeing already. And then when we start thinking about housing and human settlements, how does that infrastructure get impacted by these impacts?
So we are contributing to climate change and thus contributing to sort of the dysfunction in the natural order. Still then, how do we get to housing? How does that impact land? I know you speak about droughts and flooding and so on, so those are the obvious kinds of things. But is that really a big challenge for us in South Africa in particular?
It is. Climate change, unfortunately, it's a phenomenon that exacerbates or aggravates existing vulnerabilities. And unfortunately, with this kind of thing, it's also the most vulnerable and kind of economically marginalized that end up facing the brunt of those impacts. So when we look at the phenomenon of flooding, for example, I mean, if we look at the kind of damages that were suffered in the eThekwini and KZN in April last year, and the kinds of flooding we see here, I mean, there was quite significant flooding, I think, about 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
So often it's informal settlements, or sort of human settlements that are relatively degraded or do not have a lot of infrastructure or are not well looked after that bear the brunt of these things. So climate change, there are basically 2 legs of response. The one is mitigation, so let's stop doing what's causing the damage. In other words, let's stop burning fossil fuels. And the other one is adaptation. So how do we adapt to those impacts that are already baked into the system, that we're already going to see? Even if we stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow, we would still see some of these impacts intensifying for different periods of time. So how do we adapt? And this is where there needs to be kind of a holistic decision making and action that takes place in order to adapt so that communities like that, for example, do not sit with the kinds of risks that they sit with currently. With flooding, I mean, especially in Durban, a lot of the informal settlements are on very steep slopes. So we have these intense rainfall events that then cause mudslides, and those dwellings that are on there get washed away, and people end up getting hurt or die, and a lot of property gets damaged.
So when we're speaking about mitigation and you being, in this acting head position and knowing so much about climate change, how it affects us and how we contribute to that, what do you then suggest for people who've been living in informal settlements their entire life and, waiting for some house that's going to come, or, how do we go about that?
Well, that is the thing. I think a lot of the causes of climate change are as a result of very centralized decisions. So, I mean, for example, climate change, as I say, is caused by the burning of fossil fuels. That's kind of at national government level, decisions on what sort of, how we're going to generate electricity or that sort of thing. So this is where the notion of climate justice comes in. Those who are being impacted the most are actually the least or the smallest contributors to the issue. So it's quite interesting. I mean, you'll get the kind of fossil fuel interests, and there's been decades long of disinformation that will suggest that the responsibility for climate change lies with all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, to a certain degree it does. But the carbon footprint or the impact on climate change of someone living in an informal settlement is negligible. So, one shouldn't be looking to these people to change their ways. Instead, we should be having governance systems and political will that is not only going to sort of make the right decisions around weaning off fossil fuels, but also how to make these settlements more adapted to climate change. It's obviously a huge and complex issue. So it's an issue of spatial planning, for example. But it's also just for decision makers to face the reality that we have these patterns. Like urbanization is a big pattern in terms of human settlements. So the right sort of resources and knowledge should be brought in so that urbanization is then managed in a proper and just way.
So would you then, because there's also been talk about, so people who live in informal settlements, they can sort of create a space for themselves where they are, build things up, have hospitals and all of that good stuff, and almost like, give them what they would get in another area. Would you advise that, or would you advise against that, considering that like some of those places aren't really proper for the people anyway?
Exactly. So I think it's like with all of the climate risks, it takes a very thorough and proper assessment of situations. So there will certainly be areas where there are informal settlements, for example, where it's simply not wise to let people continue living there. Mm-hmm. Perhaps those are close to big rivers on floodplains or on slopes that are likely to be unstable and are very hard to stabilize. So there probably does need to be a degree of saying that, and we're not only talking about informal settlements, but a degree of saying that certain areas where people live are not fit for that, mm-hmm. and then that the appropriate plans need to be made to move them or to in again an equitable and just way. But in terms of areas that are not that vulnerable in these ways, the concept of upgrading informal settlements. So this is something that's quite recently the National Department of Housing came up with what they call a climate diagnostic report. And I mean, this covers a lot of these issues. And one of those is the upgrading of not only informal settlements, but other townships and areas that have been neglected for
Mm-hmm.
a long time. So in places like that, then the potential to upgrade with climate change adaptation in mind is a viable option.
Yeah.
And that could look like proper landscaping, proper drainage, to ensure that, in a flood event or an intense rainfall event, the water does get moved away safely. Creating spaces for groundwater to be replenished by runoff, and and sort of developing the concept of green spaces. So with intense heat, when there's very dense urban settlement, you get something called the heat island effect, and that's basically all the roofs getting really hot, and that makes that area on a local basis even hotter than the kind of surrounding countryside. So when thinking of upgrading existing settlements is to bring these climate considerations into account, which not only makes it a better place for people to live and have more amenities, but also then protects them against risks of climate impacts.
And so if we're thinking of this as an option, as a means, does that mean you are taking people from this area, giving them a place to live for some time, and then destroying everything there and rebuilding? Is that what it looks like?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not personally very active in the housing space per se. Safe to say that I know that the kind of injustices that we see in other activities can easily be perpetrated here. So what that looks like, I don't know. To move people from where they are settled is very challenging, and it compromises them. We have seen situations, and this is climate change related and other disaster related, where people then get moved to transit camp type situations, and suddenly they are even further away from where they work or where their social structure is, and all of that kind of thing. So these things really need to be done very carefully, and most importantly done in consultation with the people affected. And I think this is a trend we're seeing in the climate change space, but in many, in environmental and other justice spaces as well, is that decisions are made at a sort of central level for sometimes obvious reasons and sometimes not so obvious reasons, and then these decisions simply get sort of foisted upon people. With climate change adaptation, it's critically important to get the voices of those who are most impacted to the table, because they're going to know what needs are better than what some central decision maker is. And certainly the central decision maker may also have access to expertise, and the point is to get all the voices at the table, but not to sort of move people around without consulting with them, without hearing what it is that they need, without them exploring the options of what's available. Can we upgrade this place while we live here? What would that look like? Do we have to move out while that happens? Where to? For how long? And what does that mean for schools, transport, that kind of thing?
07861011112 is where you can send your questions and comments on. We are speaking to Brandon, and we are speaking about climate change and housing and how that affects us. More on this conversation right after this. On the couch, where you hear the difference, we are in conversation with the acting head of Pollution and Climate Change Program Center for Environmental Rights, Brandon Abinor. We're speaking about climate change and housing and how that impacts you, how we should understand that. I hope you guys are following, have a pen and paper, because there's a lot that we're talking about, all these gases. And I think, with the floods or with the rains that we had, I don't think we, in our minds, we're like, okay, heavy rain, okay. But those who suffered from that, they are the only ones that can really speak to it. Maybe for some of us, we had some leakage somewhere, but it's not as intense as it is for other people. And that's also a part of climate change. So I think a part of this conversation is just recognizing that, even though climate change in itself is like, oh, it's a big one. What am I doing? Cigarettes is a part of climate change's problem. Just saying. But Brandon, you wanted to speak to us about how we can, from where we are right now, the processes that we can take in order for us to be, a bit better with our world.
Exactly. So we can look at adaptation measures, sort of how you make settlements more resilient. But what is the kind of political and governance framing of that? And in climate response, we have this notion of a just transition. So that is, how do we move from a high carbon economy and society to a low carbon economy and society in a way that leaves no one behind? And sort of in the circles that we work in, it's going even beyond that. How do we make things better for people who've actually been on the receiving end of injustice and exclusion for the longest time?
Yeah.
So very narrowly put, the just transition, you could say it arises out of the concern for workers. So, we say we need to get off fossil fuels, so we need to stop burning coal. So those workers who work in the coal value chain, they shouldn't have to bear the expense or be excluded because of this necessary shift to, say, for example, renewable energy. But we can look at the just transition more broadly, and we can bring it into the notion of our food systems, our education, our transport, and our human settlements and housing. We know that, if we just have to look out the window to see the inequality with housing. We've got mansions over there, and we've got shacks over there, and the folks in the mansion get to sit through the heavy rainfall events and watch TV or whatever the case is, and the people in the shacks literally have their dwellings washed away, and people die. So how can we make the changes we need to make in a way that actually improves the life of those who are most vulnerable? And that's where this notion of the just transition comes in. And it looks at different types of justice. So one of them is procedural justice, and it speaks to what I was mentioning earlier, is whose voices are at the table. And it's actually only truly just if everybody's voices are at the table and all the concerns are properly allowed to be ventilated and all the interests are weighed up in an equitable manner. We also have distributive justice, which looks at how are the harms and the benefits distributed across society. And we have a situation at the moment where the harms are borne by certain people in the most extreme ways, while others enjoy the benefits. And like an obvious example here is we all get electricity when it's on, and that's mostly generated by coal-fired power stations in Mpumalanga. But the people that live close to those power stations live with a health epidemic. So how can we move to a system that then looks after them as well and ensures that those needs are taken care of and everyone is treated equitably?
So how do we do that?
I think, as I was saying earlier, the kind of top-down approach. Our law makes a lot of provision for participation and public participation when developments are planned, when laws are designed and intended to be implemented. And there's long been an approach where public participation is treated as a bit of a tick box. You know, it's a requirement that needs to be done. So let's go and have this meeting at this town hall for an hour. We'll throw a lot of technical jargon at people, and then we can say we've had public participation. Whereas proper public participation means also speaking to people from where they're at. So in a very literal way, it means, for example, having interpreters and translators. Yeah. It means demystifying technical information so that everyone can understand what's being spoken about, so that they can also participate. And then the other thing is, it's just a feature of our economic system, is this thing of externalizing costs. So certain interests, entities, powers out there get to perform their activities, and that's often in pursuit of making money, but the costs of that activity are not borne by those who are making the money, but rather by others. And again, pollution is quite an obvious example. You may get a factory or a power station that's generating or manufacturing, but it's also causing pollution to the water, to the air, but they're not paying for those costs. The communities around them are. And those run into the hundreds of billions. I mean, just from air pollution alone, between 2,500 and 5,000 people a year die. And those costs are not being picked up by those causing that pollution. So by getting a more true cost accounting where we don't allow parties to externalize their costs will lead us to a more just and equitable society.
0786 10 11 12 is where you can send your comments and questions. There is a listener saying there is no such thing as climate change emergency. The carbon dioxide levels is perfect the way it should be. Billions of trees on Earth which absorb all the carbon dioxide. If carbon dioxide level was as climate change, yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
The denial of climate change is not a new thing. In fact, it's been there for a long time. I can say, though, that there's the majority of the world's scientific community would disagree with that conclusion. And it's been known that our carbon dioxide levels have been 280 parts per million for, I think, close on 100,000 years. And since the burning of coal, it's risen and it's now at 420. So the increase in carbon dioxide levels and the accompanying increase in temperatures are well known and well understood. And there's scientists from all different parts of the world who are independent of each other who come to these conclusions themselves. The reason for denial can be all sorts of things. I mean, I think people often find it difficult to face difficult realities, particularly when those realities could have quite an impact on what their lives look like. But it's also a fact that the fossil fuel companies have known about this phenomenon Probably for a very long time, but it's documented from the 1950s already. And there are court cases on the go now that have unearthed memos from the scientists employed by the fossil fuel companies warning the company management of this phenomenon and the fact that there are going to be impacts and the fact that they might be held liable. And there's also evidence of how those companies have buried this. And if we consider that the fossil fuel industry as a whole makes $3 billion a day, we can see why it's like this. Why would someone making that amount of money want to give it up? But that's unfortunately exactly what's got to happen, and there has to be a transition to a cleaner way of doing things.
I mean, you say unfortunately that has to happen, but we're speaking about 3 billion a day. And I mean, so I suppose for those of us who are really still trying to put it together in terms of climate change and housing, how that impacts me, how that impacts where I live and my family and so on, to 3 billion, it's like it's a wide space to sort of like swim in, because it doesn't make sense. How does that 3 billion affect me if I don't really see it? I'm thinking 3 billion can affect us if we build more houses, so them coming to where we need to be in terms of being more greener, I don't know how possible that is. But just thinking about, you saying denial, maybe we just don't understand climate change for what it is, and we haven't really studied it that much. And natural disasters is sort of just one of those things that we're like, oh, it's nature taking its course. It's not really like, because I think of flooding and how some buildings and places were affected, and I'm just thinking it was heavy rains. We live in a place where we weren't supposed to live. #apartheid. And it's just like a cycle, but it's never really like, okay, we hear, okay, #apartheid, but climate change could be a contributing factor, and I'm also contributing to that. So it's really a big ocean to swim into.
It is. It's a tricky space, and I mean, in a sense, it's a new phenomenon if we're looking at over a timeline of generations. And in a certain sense, many of the impacts are only starting to bite now. And when I say now, I mean perhaps even sort of 20, 30 years ago. So it's perhaps not that strange that human consciousness as a whole is sort of getting to grips with this new thing. And you're absolutely right that flooding has always happened. People have always built houses where they shouldn't have. That is true. And there have been tropical cyclones and strong winds and all of those things. They're not new phenomena per se. But the evidence is in that these are increasing, and the degree to which they can be attributed to climate change is there in scientific terms as well. We look at the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This particular body is made up of scientists, not politicians. There's another climate change body at the UN called the UNFCCC, and that's a political one, and the heads of state are involved there, and that's where sort of negotiating and wrangling go on. But at this intergovernmental panel level, it's scientists from all over the world. And their reports, and they come up with these assessment reports. They've just released the 6th one over, say, the last 15 or 20 years or so, draws from studies from like tens of thousands of scientists around the world. And they collate this information, and it's there to be seen. So I guess things are going to get more intense, and more people are going to start to understand those linkages, hopefully sooner rather than later.
Yeah, it seems like the world is sort of going into shambles. I mean, the conversation about climate change has been ongoing. Just again, for people that is waiting for a home, it's a bit different. I'm not really considering that. But I think it's important that it's something that they think about, especially the community leaders who are fighting for housing. So part of the conversation, as you say, is that, okay, if we are going to upgrade where we are staying, or this community, this area, please do consider A, B, and C before you decide. So that, I think, makes sense. So having architects, having all the people that contribute to what would make a good place and good environment need to consider that. But overall, thinking about climate change is a bit difficult.
It is a bit difficult, and I think, I mean, this brings me to what people can do. You know, if you're not the CEO of a fossil fuel company, or you don't have
3
these
billion,
massive high carbon devices under your control, you know, it's not your personal choices aren't going to make that much difference. But then that's where the political engagement starts to become important. Is engage first of all with your neighbours around the issue, and then the ward councillors. Perhaps if you belong to a political party or a civic movement, engage with at those levels about this, and just check if those decision makers and those representatives are in fact aware of this issue. And the opportunity with climate change is that the things that we can do to address climate change are actually the same things that we can do to bring justice and a better life in a whole range of spheres. A better transport system, better food that's not sort of grown hundreds of k's away, but it's local and it's more nutritious, and everyone is getting proper nutrition. Proper management of water, green spaces, which is good for climate, but it's good for people's well-being as well. So addressing this can actually make things better, and that's the kind of true hope and dream of a just transition, is that we use the impetus of this crisis to make things better.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about food insecurity, and so food and housing, you know, like, you're not supposed to choose one or the other. You're supposed to have both, because it's your right to have shelter and food and clothing and so on. So definitely something to consider. But so how would you advise these community leaders to go about it in understanding climate change when they are addressing, when, you know, the people who do make the decisions, give them an opportunity to share their voices and their thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's understanding what climate change will look like in the particular settlement in which you are. You know, we can talk about the general principles here, but then let's look at Imizamo Yethu, for example. What is it about that actual space on the planet with those dwellings in that form that is vulnerable to climate change? And, you know, in the case of strong rains and sort of ever-increasing winds and that kind of thing. So how do the people there get together and speak to those who make decisions and see that those decisions are the right ones? The Western Cape government has recently come out with a draft climate change strategy. I can't remember the exact name. And in that document, they talk about this concept of a climate assembly. So that document's about 110 pages or so, and it recognizes the issue and maps it out and talks about different responses. And one of them is the establishment of a climate assembly where all sorts of people can get together to share information, to share their experiences in terms of climate-related impacts, or what their needs are, or what they think their needs will be when certain things intensify. And this basically creates a platform for those voices to be elevated. Because there's this huge disconnect between someone in an informal settlement and someone who sits in the Premier's office or whatever the case is. And how do we ensure that communication becomes more two-way? So that we're not sort of designing and devising all these solutions over here, and the reality on the ground is either not changing or getting worse. So it's about enhancing participatory democracy and speaking, and to be able to participate like that, awareness of the issues helps. So, you know, we certainly would like to see more climate change awareness. It's starting to be taught in schools. I don't know what the status of that is. I'm sure it's going in the right direction, and probably could be improved as well. But then people will start to understand and draw the linkages between this notion, which can feel very far off, and realities such as access to water and food. Another aspect to bear in mind is that climate change impacts are disproportionately felt by women and girls. And there's a whole range of reasons for that. In many parts of the world, it's women who will go collect water or wood. And because of the changing climate and landscape, they have to go further and further away, and that subjects them to higher risks. Women often have less political and economic power, and therefore have less say in something very important like human settlements. I mean, we're talking about the home.
Yeah.
And the Department of Housing's climate diagnostic report, for example, was unfortunately silent on gender. And gender-based violence comes into this as well. When you have disaster situations, like, for example, areas getting washed away, then you have these transit camps or temporary camps, and then those environments become risky and hostile, and gender-based violence and sexual assault and that kind of thing can also happen there. So that's another whole dimension to this, is the gender justice issue.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's a lot to take in, because shame, oftentimes you do find that the women are going out to seek and making sure, and then I'm asking myself, where are the men? I'm not assuming that the men are dead, but then also I'm not assuming that the men are at work, because then I think that if the mother, sister, whoever needs to go get the water, then the men in the family should do that, or the men in the community should do that. So this shouldn't affect us that much, but it is. There is a question from a listener asking about, airplanes and rockets and all of how much of the burning massive amounts of carbon dioxide that comes from that. How do we then intend to prevent that to become more greener? Because there's a lot of things to look at if we're trying to be a lot greener. Like, we're looking at green versus 3 billion a day.
That's exactly it. And there are all these aspects, but let me talk on aviation, because that's the one that the listener asked about. Aviation is a reasonably significant contributor to climate change. Burning all that jet fuel, and also where it's being burnt up in the higher parts of the atmosphere. So, I mean, there's going to have to be less flying. I mean, this is the thing, is that climate change impacts all sorts of things. However, I mean, engineering and science is engaging with all of these things, and the pathway to aviation still continuing at all is supposed to be to use hydrogen instead of the fossil fuels. That's the intention. Maybe that will come to pass, maybe it won't. But yeah, transport in general, even just using the kind of road-based fossil fuel-driven transport that we have sort of on land, using lots of trucks instead of a train, for example. A train will have a far lower carbon footprint for what it can do than the equivalent number of trucks. So all of these things need to start moving in that direction towards the green and away from the $3 billion a day.
Yeah, I think living green is like living large. It's almost like a luxury, and to compare that luxury to, again, 3 billion a day is a bit much. It almost feels like a war in itself, that I would be greedy enough to consider a whole country population's health. But there is a listener who sent in a comment, and it sounds more like a shout out. It says, Salam, shukran for the informative program. We have a Mr. Daniels, our recycling company, that collects our recycling items every Thursday in Mount View and the surrounding areas. Mr. Daniels really makes a difference in our area. So in one way, there's an appreciation for climate change, for the little things, but it is bigger, and God willing, we actually get to a solution, or maybe a compromise, maybe a good compromise on people's health and people's well-being, and that's not just them breathing proper air, not fearing that they won't have food for their kids and so on. But Brandon, thank you so much for speaking to us this evening. Lots about climate change. Let me know what your guys' thoughts are on climate change, what you think we can do. I know recycling is one of them, but What else can we do? Having this conversation, and do you think we can make this change? And do you think we'll be alive in the next 30 years? Let's think about that. This is On the Couch on 100.4 FM. I'm Farida Ravi and Soki and Zinzi. Up next is Reflections with Ayubali.